Hi, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here at Nicholson Library with Dr. Thomas Hellie. It's April 12th, 2018. And Dr. Hellie, we'll start by asking you, why Linfield?
I think it was March or April of 2005, my wife and I came to McMinnville. I had business in Oregon. We really liked Oregon Pinot Noir. We decided to stay in McMinnville and visit a couple of wineries, and we fell in love with the place. In fact, we began picking up real estate guides the second day we were here because we thought we might retire here someday. We went back to Chicago where we were living, and we're telling all our friends about how cool this place was. And 2 weeks later, I got called by a search firm. It was a search consultant who had been working with me in the 1990s when I thought I might want to be a college president. And I had actually told him that I decided that I wasn't going to become a college president because I was the head of the Kemper Foundation. It was a great job. We loved Chicago. And but he called me because he said Linfield had a field search, and they were looking for somebody who not only had an academic background, as I did, but also had some experience outside of, narrowly speaking, outside of colleges. And the fact that I'd worked with the foundation and that our foundation did some work with business education made him think that I might be suitable. I told him that if this had been anywhere else, I would not have been interested, but I was interested because it was McMinnville. However, I still didn't know a lot about Linfield. I knew about the college. I first heard of the college actually reading the Wine Spectator in a little article about the International Pinot Noir celebration. And I had a friend who was working here, and not a close friend, but somebody, maybe an acquaintance even at that point, Bruce Wyatt. But I knew that Bruce was extremely talented, and I figured he wouldn't go to a place that wasn't a good place. So I started doing research on the college. I called a friend at Willamette and asked him what he knew about the college. He told me that at that point we had just opened this library, and he told me that they were completely envious of our library, and told me about some of the faculty here and how much he admired them. I looked at what had gone on at the college and what Vivian Bull had been able to accomplish, and I thought, my goodness, this is an incredible opportunity, and also a college that really doesn't have the people don't know about it as they should, because it's so much better than anyone realized. And so I threw my hat in the ring. At the foundation, I'd been there for 7 years, and it was good work, it was important work, it was not hard work. And I found myself sort of envying the people that we were giving the grants to, because they were the ones who were actually able to make real change. And they were the ones who were able to interact with students and with faculty. And so all of those things led to my applying. And of course, they still had, I don't know how many, but they still had at least 40 or 50 applicants. And I know that there were 2 other finalists. And so it wasn't until December of 2005 that I was actually selected.
So let's back up a little bit. You talked about Kemper Foundation. Sort of talk about kind of your path to that, and then sort of into higher education in general.
So I grew up on a farm in southwest Minnesota. I was the first in my family to go to college. I went to a small private liberal arts college, very much like Linfield. It's Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. It had about 1,800 students, primarily living on campus. And I had a great experience there with great faculty mentors, and I decided I wanted to go on to graduate school and become a professor myself. I went to the University of Missouri and got a PhD in theater history, and then I went to a small private college outside of Cleveland, Ohio called Hiram College, where I had a joint appointment in theater and English. Back in 1980, there were very, very few faculty jobs available anywhere. But it turned out that that was a pretty good fit for me. I was there for 9 years, but I was increasingly involved in international study programming and in administration. I really liked planning. And so I decided to begin looking at administrative jobs, and in 1989, I went to the Associated Colleges of the Midwest in Chicago, which is a consortium of 14 selective private colleges in Midwestern states. Carleton, McAllister in St. Olaf in Minnesota, Lawrence, Ripon, and Beloit in Wisconsin, Lake Forest, Knox, Monmouth, and at that time the University of Chicago in Illinois, Grinnell, Cornell, and Co. in Iowa, and Colorado College. Since that time, the University of Chicago, because it was so much bigger than the others, decided to leave the consortium, and my old alma mater, Luther College, was invited to join. But I was there for 10 years, and I worked extensively in international study. I managed international study programs on 3 or 4 continents. I closed our program in Yugoslavia when the Civil War broke out. I opened the second program, American exchange program in what was Czechoslovakia in 1991. I started a new program in Tanzania in the late 1990s. In fact, our students arrived the very day that the U.S. Embassy was blown up. So there were a lot of adventures in international study. I also worked fairly closely with college presidents and academic deans on strategic planning and other kinds of institutional issues, which provided me with a kind of broad understanding of how private higher education works. As I said earlier, I was beginning to think about becoming a college president someday, and I applied for a few. Didn't get them, which was a good thing now in retrospect, because I was too young and I would have screwed too many things up. But one of my references, the president of Lake Forest College, called me and said that the Kemper Foundation was looking for a new executive director and president. And the CEO of Kemper Insurance, who was also the chair of the board of the foundation, was a good friend of the president of Lake Forest. And so I thought, well, it might be very interesting to do this. I thought I could do it someday, but I hadn't really thought it was going to be that soon in my career. But it would allow us to stay in Chicago, and we loved Chicago. It would be a way to do something different. I loved the ACM, but I'd been doing it for 10 years. So I applied, they hired me, and it was, as it turned out, a very, very good experience. Though at first I felt like a fish out of water. I actually felt more out of place in corporate culture than I had when I was in Tanzania for the first time. But it was an extremely valuable learning experience. And in particular, because I was included in some of the senior level business meetings at the corporation with all of the executive and senior vice presidents and the CEO, I learned a lot about how business works, and it was extremely valuable to me, not just in understanding management of money. I mean, that was something that I was already doing as a college administrator at the ACM, but especially in understanding long-term strategy and understanding how that very important sector of our country operates. So I was there for 7 years. Most of our grant making was to colleges and universities, which is why they typically hired someone from higher ed. I fully expected to stay there the rest of my professional life until Linfield came along.
So what was the sort of nature of your work at Kemper? You said you're part of a granting organization.
So we did 2 things, or maybe 3 things primarily. The biggest thing dollar-wise was, at that time, was to make grants to colleges and universities. When I first came, we were making grants to both public and private institutions, and we were focusing them pretty exclusively on business schools. For a variety of reasons, Kemper Insurance and the Kemper Foundation separated. The Kemper Foundation had its own money. It was privately chartered, but it had been structured in such a way that it was acting like a corporate foundation. That needed to change because Kemper Insurance was changing, and so I refocused the foundation to give our grants primarily to private colleges and universities, to talk about liberal arts as an ideal preparation for careers in business and administration. Not necessarily a business major, but but that people who major in the liberal arts disciplines are learning skills that are fully applicable and useful throughout society. We also continued to support something called the Kemper Scholar Program, which was a very generous scholarship internship program that had originally been narrowly focused on insurance business, but became much more broadly focused on both for-profit and nonprofit sectors. And then we had a grant-making program for arts organizations in Chicago. And because of my background in theater history, that actually was a pretty good fit for me too.
So you get to Linfield, and what is sort of your initial perception of the college?
Well, many of the, it had been my job really at the foundation to sort of identify strengths and weaknesses of colleges and universities that we were making grants to. And even at the Associated Colleges of the Midwest, I had a bird's eye view of, well, sometimes closer than bird's eye view of 14 colleges. And so I wasn't, and Linfield had been very effectively run, and people communicated very honestly and clearly with me. So there were no really big surprises when I came. I was, delighted. And I was struck by how friendly people were on campus. I loved meeting with students, still do, and was also struck by the talent and deep commitment of our faculty and of our staff. Really, I thought that when I came, I thought that the next great opportunity for us was going to be in philanthropy. I think that was one of the reasons that they hired me, because I, from working in a foundation, I knew something about what donors might be interested in. And so even before I arrived, we began talking about possibly starting a fundraising campaign that would align with our sesquicentennial in 2008. And so we made plans, we hired a consultant, we worked with the board, we devised a strategy, and then the Great Recession occurred. And suddenly, and this I think happens with every presidency, you think you do have a strategy, you think you know what you're going to do, and then suddenly other stuff happens. And you've got to, it depends how big the stuff is. At first, of course, no one knew how bad the recession was going to be. But after a while, we realized it really was a problem, and that we weren't going to be able to raise $100 million or whatever the number was, because, we had people who had made commitments who, couldn't pay them because they'd lost millions of dollars in the stock market, or in one case was a real estate developer who lost everything. And so that forced us to really refocus. Meanwhile, we're worried about our students going to come. It's expensive to go to a private college. There were several things, though, that happened that really helped us. One was that what was then called the Division of Continuing Education is now called Online and Continuing Education. Turned out to be very popular with people who were looking to retool in order to get back into the job market. And so our enrollments there significantly increased. Another thing that happened that was not really related to the recession, but in fact it wasn't at all, we reorganized the way in which our nursing program was structured. And that enabled us to bring in a much larger number of nursing majors than we had previously had. And even though the recession was putting pressure on the economy, nursing was one area where people were very interested and able to get jobs after graduation. Then a really important thing happened for the college. Tozzi, who's one of our trustees, is best known for the winery and vineyard that he owns. But Mo is an engineer by training, and he actually has a small construction business. And in talking to me, Mo said, construction firms right now are struggling because nobody is hiring them. And the name of the game at this point in a recession is just to try to keep your people together so that when the economy recovers, all of those pent-up building projects that people couldn't afford to do are going to come online, and they're going to be great opportunities for construction firms. And so he said a lot of us are willing to do projects even at below cost if we're able to keep our people together. And he said if you can find a way to finance the renovation of Northup Library, which was to be part of the campaign, he said, I think you're going to be able to do it for a lot less money than what you were originally told it would cost. And in fact, he was completely right. When we did the renovation of Northup Library, which now is named T.J. Day Hall, we were able to do it for less than 80% of what the official appraisal had been when we had begun talking about this. And it, it turned out really well. Now, we also still had to raise the money, and so several trustees stepped up, to do that, and most importantly, TJ did. TJ Day has really never received the recognition he deserved. TJ had a role in every major building project the college had, probably for the 25 years after he graduated from college. He was always a very modest guy. He never wanted public recognition, which is one of the reasons that people didn't realize that. But he paid for, I think, half or maybe even a little more than half of the cost of what is now T.J. Day Hall, and did so at a time when, money wasn't sloshing around. Other trustees also made meaningful contributions, and if you go over to T.J. Day Hall, you'll see their names in various locations in the building, and they too were doing this at a time when there wasn't, stock values had fallen significantly, and so it was a leap of faith, but it really paid off for us. Other things about the college that I was struck by how beautiful it is, how much space there is. I was struck by the library, which of course is a renovated Hewlett-Packard manufacturing building. And when I first arrived, actually I think even before I took office, I was visiting and I asked to go on an admissions tour because I figured it would be a good way to learn what was going on with admissions tours, and it would also be a good way to learn more about the college. And so I was with a couple of families and we were walking along, and as we approached the library, the tour guide told us the story of how the Hewlett-Packard campus had come to be and how this building had been sort of dramatically changed in order to become a library. And we walked in the door, and the father of a young woman who eventually became a student here sort of gasped and said, "Wow, this sure looks a lot more impressive than it does on the outside." But in fact it does. It has such a wonderful atmosphere. All the light, all the wood. It's really a beautiful place. I wasn't surprised by the fervor over football. I knew that was a part of Linfield's tradition. I was surprised, and I'm still surprised, though this has improved, that Linfield isn't better known in Portland. It has improved, but we still have more work to do there. I was surprised that some people regionally didn't know how good we are. I think that's improved too.
What would you say were your biggest successes as president? When I arrived, I wasn't surprised by this because I'd already read the data, but I was struck by the fact that Linfield was such a homogeneous institution ethnically. Of course, I was coming from Chicago, which is a very ethnically diverse city, but we really, I was surprised by this, and I was concerned about it because I knew that demographics were changing. I knew that our students were entering a multi-ethnic world, and I believed that higher education had a responsibility to provide our students with the kind of experiences that would prepare them for that world. I also believed, and still believe, that we needed to have a more diverse student population so that as demographics changed, we would be perceived as a welcoming place rather than an outlier. So when I came, I got together what was the small group of Latino students and asked them for ideas about how we could reach out to the community. I worked with our admissions and financial aid leaders. We had faculty who made commitments to this. We provided some funding for programming to see what would work. And so I'm really proud of the fact that Linfield is now, has been for the last 2 years ranked as the most diverse private liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. That was a pretty dramatic change for us and an important one. I'm really proud of our success in creating endowed faculty positions. We've been able to attract some great faculty and retain great faculty. And we've also been able to add to the size of the faculty because of the fundraising we've been able to do. I think it's 6 positions, I think. So I'm very proud of that. We had a few endowed positions before this, but none of them were endowed at a particularly high level of money. I mean, these were, $1 and $2 million endowments now that we have. I'm proud of that we've made some improvements with the physical plant. I mean, TJ Day is the most notable example, but Taylor Hall was significantly renovated. And we've made, some improvements in Riley and Dillon and Walker and Melrose. It seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that the old part of campus needed some attention after the new part of campus having, gotten so much development in the 1990s. I'm very proud of what we've been able to do in distinguishing ourselves in the wine industry. There's no other, to my knowledge, there's no other private college like us in the country that has this kind of relationship with the wine industry. Now, different colleges have relationships with different industries. It makes sense. But Oregon now has almost 750 bonded wineries. It's a $5.6 billion industry. There are 30,000 people who are directly employed in the wine industry in Oregon. That is a radical growth even from when I arrived, 12 years ago. It's more than, I think it's like tripled. But there are opportunities for our students in that industry if they want them. We've been able to create an undergraduate major that's different than anyone else's in the world because we've really aligned it with our own values as a liberal arts institution. And I think it's something that's just beginning, but is going to really put Linfield on the map in another way. And of course, the Oregon Wine History Archive and the archivist's position are a part of that whole story as well. There were several people who, in my early years here, said to me, Linfield ought to think about collecting the records and materials from the early pioneers. And I honestly don't remember who first suggested that to me. I can think of 3 or 4 people who did. But the most important event was when Susan Sokol-Blosser, who was herself one of those pioneers, came to my office and said, I've turned over the winery to my children. They need my office. I have all of these materials from when we started the winery in the early years of the winery. I don't want to throw them away. And Susan, of course, has a master's degree in history. In fact, she taught at Linfield in her very first years in the Willamette Valley. And she had worked in the archives in, North Carolina. And so she actually, she presented to me a copy of a document
or a catalog that she had helped create in the North Carolina State Archives when she was fresh out of school. And so I said, well, Susan, I'm interested in this, but I'm going to need your help. And so we sort of strategized on how to approach different people. And a key for us was when Dickie Rath said, yes, I will do this. I will give my papers to Linfield. But then, as you know, things just kept happening. We were able to hire Rachel Woody, who really got us off the ground. Then you began working with her, Rich, and took over when she left. And you know, I'm very proud of this. I think this is another thing that has distinguished Linfield from other institutions. We know we've gotten national publicity, and we know we've had international researchers looking at it. And so I know you feel good about that, and you should.
Thank you.
I think that I think it's also, I'm also proud of the fact that our endowment has doubled since I came. And some of that is the stock market, but actually a good part of it has also been fundraising, and even a part of it has been the work, an important part of it has been the work of the trustee committee that deals with investments, and with our consultant, Ashley Merring at Selwood Investments, who graduated from Linfield about 20 years ago. But that we have been, our performance has been in the top 10% of all institutions like us for about a decade now, and that's something that I'm really proud of. And I also think that every president works on developing a board, and every president has different people that he or she attracts to the Board of Trustees. And Linfield has had very loyal, dedicated trustees for many years, long before I came. But one of the things that I'm proud of is that I think our trustees are more directly engaged with the college than used to be the case. That's been a strategy that Dave Hageberg, who was the board chair for 8 years, and I developed. And in fact, it began with my conversations with the first board chair that I worked for, Glenna Kruger, who said we need to make some changes and get the board more engaged. And both Glenna and Dave also hoped that we could recruit more trustees who cared about Linfield, but came from a larger geographic area and from perhaps a broader set of professional experiences. And I think we've done that quite well. I mean, we've really got some heavyweights on the board, and they care passionately about the college.
So you mentioned sort of the Great Recession right as you're starting your tenure. What are some of the other sort of challenges you've faced, whether Linfield specific or more higher education in general?
Well, I think right now actually we're in a very challenging time for higher education in general and independent higher education, to be certain. There was a kind of aftermath from the recession that has to do with money and with debt. And right now, it's understandable, but it's problematic that people are very concerned about accruing any debt when they go to college. I actually did the math on how much debt I had when I finished school and what it would be in today's dollars, and also how much tuition I paid and what it would be in today's dollars. I paid $4,000 in tuition my senior year in college. Well, that equates to what the average student at Linfield pays now. The big difference is that the sticker price has changed, and that's because of the way in which all of us in this field have changed our pricing. It's a real challenge for independent higher education because almost all of us are giving a dramatic amount of financial aid, much more than was available when I went to college. But as long as that top number looks so high, a lot of people don't even consider applying. And people don't understand, and that's, I get that too. But there are other problems that are related, but not just about price. The second issue is I don't think people are
really looking at the data which show what the value of this kind of education is, and how if you do have debt, over the course of even your first 10 years, but certainly over a lifetime, it's much better to have a good education in that debt economically than it is not to. There's a lot of talk about free college now and free community college in Oregon. Fewer than 10% of the students who go to community college those who are planning to go on for a 4-year degree, fewer than 10% of them go on. That's a national statistic, but it's a very similar statistic in Oregon. But how do you argue with somebody when it's free versus a lot of money? And then I think many students assume that they will be the exception to the rule. But so far, that's not working. I think it's terrible public policy for the state to have adopted this, but I think that it is what it is, and it's something that now a reality we have to live with. And then, of course, there's all of this discussion about whether a college degree is even worth it anymore. Excuse me. And the data shows that it is. But whenever a reporter can find a hook, an unusual story, that's what gets the attention, especially in this day and age when writing about something that's sort of extreme and sort of radical is the only way you get attention. And so those of us in higher ed really worry about these things. And I think that it is a very challenging time for independent higher education. And it's terribly ironic because we do the best job of graduating students. Nobody comes even close. The average family income at Linfield is actually lower than it is at the University of Oregon. It's true at Linfield, but it's true in our entire independent sector in Oregon. More than 65% of our students graduate in 4 years or less. In the public sector, more than 65% of them graduate in 6 years or more. So just in terms of pure earning power over 2 years, there's a difference. But once again, if I'm accepted at Oregon State and I'm not going to have to pay very much, and I'm accepted at Linfield or Willamette and I'm going to have to pay more, I just assume I'll be the exception to the rule and I'll be able to graduate in 4 years rather than 6 at OSU. So that's an issue for us right now, and we're doing everything we can to make the value proposition clearer for our institutions.
So I'm curious, since you've worked in so many different sort of parts of higher education, have you sort of developed an educational philosophy as you've climbed the ranks?
Well, look at what a crazy background I've got. Sometimes when I meet with groups of parents, I'll ask them to raise their hands if they are working in a field that is directly related to what they majored in college. And they always laugh, and fewer than half of them raise their hands. So I majored in theater. My PhD in theater history, it was sort of like Janet Gupton here at Linfield. I directed plays as well as teaching courses in literature and history. But then I became interested. I started taking students abroad. I became interested in study abroad, so I got involved in planning and administering study abroad. Then I became an administrator, and there I was literally overseeing programs from anthropology to zoology. Then I went to a foundation that was associated with a business and emphasized business education and business careers. And then I came to Linfield. Well, I was able to do all of those things, not because I'm so much more gifted, but rather because I had a really solid liberal arts education. And a really good liberal arts education makes you adaptable. You learn how to learn. You learn to communicate with people. You learn how to work in teams. You learn to be curious. And you learn how to apply different approaches to problems. And that's what's really enabled me to be successful. And I think that's what will enable people to be successful in the future. In fact, half of the jobs we have in America today didn't exist 20 years ago. And so
for us to be training someone narrowly for a specific profession with specific training, I think is a huge mistake, because the job they'll be doing 20 years from now doesn't exist right now. What we need to do is to teach them to learn how to learn, because they're going to have to learn throughout their lives, and they need to have a broad set of skills. So my philosophy remains fiercely committed to the liberal arts, and my experience only confirms that that's something that's even more valuable for the future than it has been in the past. Now with robotics and with artificial intelligence, the ability of human beings to be creative and to think in a less linear fashion will be even more unique than it has been in the past. The problem we have, though, is that too many in our society and in our government don't understand the importance of the liberal arts. And so, in fact, that's another challenge we're facing right now, is that people are worried that if there's not a job that's directly connected to a particular career, that by majoring in something, they're going to somehow undermine their economic future. And I understand that, but the data shows that if they're smart and if they're adaptable, they're going to be fine. And in fact, in many cases, they'll do better than some of their counterparts who majored in some narrow field.
How do you go about alleviating that? How do you communicate that to parents and
Well, I talk about it quite a bit. Something else that I'm really proud of, and this is more personal, it's not about the college, is that that for 2 years, until recently, I was the chair of the board of directors of the Council of Independent Colleges, which is the national association of all small private colleges and universities. I was elected by my fellow presidents, and so that was, really an incredible honor. But the CIC has worked very hard on a set of materials, conferences, research reports, all of them demonstrating what I just said about the value of the liberal arts and the myths about college debt and the importance of this kind of education. And so, through that organization, I've been trying to, in my role on the board, we've been trying to spread that word and have had direct contact with reporters from the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and Washington Post and New York Times. But the way in which stories are told and the way in which media operates nowadays is not as simple as it was even 10 years ago. So that's been a challenge.
So clearly, a large part of your job is sort of fostering relationships at a lot of different levels. So we hear from a lot of students who say the first time meeting you or interacting with you was when you sat down at Dillon for lunch. So what made you decide to do that, and what have you gotten out of those experiences?
It was impulsive. It wasn't a plan. I was here in the fall of when the students. It was actually the spring of 2006. I arrived in April, and I needed to get lunch, and I went over to Dillon and I sat down with some students and really enjoyed it. One of the things that I liked most when I was at the Kemper Foundation, and I think this was another factor in my deciding I wanted to come back to a college, was that at Kemper, I didn't have to do this, but I chose to mentor some of the students who were getting these scholarships from us. And that was the most satisfying and fulfilling experience that I had when I was at the foundation. And so even though my job here doesn't take me into contact with students very often at all, I'm at least in physical proximity, and being able to go to Dillon and talk to them was valuable. And it's valuable in two ways. First of all, it's a great way to get information. I almost always ask how students heard about Linfield, why they decided to come here, where they thought about coming in addition to Linfield, because you learn things about how we're perceived and what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. I sometimes ask them what they
like most and what they don't like. But I also just find it, the second way in which it's valuable to me is that it just keeps me going. I'm not the only, I know another president who actually does the same thing, and neither of us knew this about each other, but it came up in a conversation last year. And he said when things are really feeling tough, he makes it a point to go over to the cafeteria at his institution and sit down with students and have lunch with them, because it reminds him of why he is still willing to do this job when it gets really tough.
Sure.
And it is the reason that I think all of us are here, ultimately. And that's not just the president, it's not just our faculty, it's not just you, it's true of our ground staff, it's true of people who work at Linfield. It's, we're here because of students.
So what about sort of fostering relationships sort of in the internal community, staff and faculty, alumni, board of directors?
When I came here, I stole this idea from one of the other presidents I knew back in the Midwest, but when I came here I announced that I would like to meet with every faculty member who at least would meet with me in his or her office. And I met with probably 85% of the faculty that first 6 months. That was an important way for me to learn about the college, learn about what these people were doing, to understand the culture, really important to understand the culture. And then for the first few years that we were here, Julie and I, my wife Julie and I, had dinners at the house about every 2 weeks, and we'd try to invite faculty and staff, often who didn't know each other very well at least, together, and those were also good interactions. That ended, for the most part, when Julie decided that she really wanted to go back to work. When we were in Chicago, she was running continuing care facilities for senior citizens with more employees than than Linfield has. And then when we moved to McMinnville, suddenly, her life changed radically, and she was only known as my wife, and ultimately that just was not satisfying enough for her. So, I actually regret the fact that we have not had as many social interactions since then, though it just wasn't possible once she, was getting up at 5 in the morning and getting home at 5:30 or 6 in the evening.
Sure.
Another thing that I did when I first arrived that was extremely valuable was with staff I job shadowed. So I traveled around campus on a Friday night with campus public safety. That was interesting because students were not at all intimidated by campus safety or me, but when the football coach showed up, suddenly they were changing their attitude quite a bit. I helped clean some residence halls. I did a little stuff with buildings and grounds. I tried to, and there were some other things like that too, but I thought it would be a useful way for me to understand how the place really works and to really also develop some relationships with people. As time has gone by, I've had less and less time on campus and less of that interaction and more time off campus. It's a very common pattern for presidents because typically we are doing more fundraising at the second half of our presidencies than we are in the first half. We've built up relationships. With trustees, I've tried to meet with trustees individually and get to know them. I've always tried to recruit trustees who I believe are smarter than I am and who are people who we could never, ever in a million years afford to pay as consultants. So instead, they pay us to be our consultants. With alumni, there's just a kind of, and this is very standard practice, but you go around and have alumni events. I'm leaving tonight for Denver, and we have an event with alumni and parents and prospective students there, and I'm having dinner with some alumni tomorrow night.
So I would say, and then there are things like homecoming that are sort of the standard ways to interact with alumni. Homecoming is an absolutely exhausting weekend for me. We will typically have 5 or 6 reunion class gatherings, all of which I go to. And of course, there are the athletic events, and there are different leadership volunteer groups that are meeting, and so it's a busy time. There are 2 things at the college that you might ask me about, but I might as well mention them now because they happen to be on my mind, and they're related, I think, to the culture of our college. And the 2 events that have impressed me the most, in terms of just the sheer joy and energy and creativity and organization, are commencement, which is amazing. I mean, and the fact that all of our staff are out there doing all of these things. We have advancement staff who are wiping off bleachers. Our buildings and grounds people there are there at like 6 in the morning getting everything finalized because they want it to be as perfect for our students as possible. That's an amazing, amazing event. The other one that I was introduced to it just a week or 2 after. It was nearly might have been my first important event at the college, and a great introduction to the college is the luau. And I used to be a theater director, and I'm so amazed by the quality of the performance that the Hawaiian Club does. It's all student led. It's really, really amazing, and there's such joy and energy. Now, it's still not there, but what's beginning to take on a similar kind of energy is the fall. We've called it different things. It was originally called the Hispanic Heritage Day, but the fall events celebrating Hispanic cultures. And I'm hoping that will also become a kind of trademark of the college and a way to celebrate who we are as a community. Unlike the luau, we have not yet been able to engage as many majority students in that event. Luau has people from all over the place involved, but we're getting there. And I think that will be another identifier for Linfield.
So I'm curious, with the alumni specifically, I have found in my role here that alumni are incredibly devoted to Linfield. Has that seemed more so to you than other colleges you've been affiliated with? Does the relationship seem different, or is that kind of typical?
It's a funny thing, Rich, and I did not have the same kind of, as I was talking before about how I had this opportunity to look at other colleges. I really didn't have direct contact with their alumni. I agree with you that Linfield alumni, by and large, tend to be very loyal and they talk about their institution. I think I see more Linfield bumper stickers around here than I see Willamette or Lewis and Clark bumper stickers. But Linfield has a lot more Oregonians than Lewis and Clark or Willamette. I don't know if it's still true, but 2 years ago, Willamette, the state providing the largest number of students for Willamette was California, and the number 2 state was Washington. Oregon was number 3. Yesterday, the president of Lewis and Clark told me that 10% of his students come from Oregon.
Oh my gosh.
At Linfield, especially if you count online and continuing education and nursing, it's upwards of 70%. So maybe it's not a surprise that we see our bumper stickers because, people tend to stay in the state where they come from. If you look at data, though, Linfield is not particularly distinguished in terms of alumni giving, and it's something I've scratched my head about for a long time. Our percentage of alumni giving is significantly lower than that of my alma mater. It's probably half of what it is at Luther. It's never been my sense that Luther's alumni were more loyal than Linfield's. In fact, if anything, I think maybe the opposite. And so it must have to do instead with a kind of attitude about giving back or philanthropy, which is also puzzling to me because I think of our students and our graduates as people who want to help society. So apparently they don't
think of their alma mater in quite the same way as I think of mine. On the other hand, I've known alumni who will travel 2,000 miles to see our football team. And I occasionally I just saw an email today from an alum who's in Japan and was so fired up about having run into a set of Linfield alumni in different parts of Japan. So there is this sense of connection and shared experience that I think is very strong, even almost palpable here.
I'm also curious, so obviously my alma mater does not have a real strong town and gown relationship, but in coming here for me was eye-opening for seeing the Linfield McMinnville relationship, and then kind of learning they sort of grown up together. I'm curious, in your experience fostering those relationships with the community, how that's gone for you and your perceptions of that.
Well, quite candidly, I think that I think I inherited a great situation. It is an unusually good relationship, and there I do have some information to base that judgment on. I think that a lot of it has to do with simply the people who have led the institution and also the people who were leaders in town. I think that has a lot to do with it. People developed relationships, and there's a kind of continuity of relationships that gets passed on from one to the next. I also think the size of our town makes a difference, and the quality or character of the relationship is intensified by the smallness of the town. So if it's a good relationship, it's really good, and if it's a bad relationship, it's really bad. And fortunately at Linfield, it's really good. Now, I do think that I don't think that the relationship is significantly worse than it was when I came, but I don't think it's better. And that's in part because the nature of being the president of Linfield has changed. And I probably travel 2 or 3 times as much as my predecessors did. Because our alumni base is national and international, and because fundraising now has become such an important part of what a college president does, much more, it was always important, but it's even more important and more expected today than it once was. But after this meeting, I will go to something called a meeting of the Linfield, the McMinnville Leadership Council. It's a group of civic leaders that meets once a month. Not just civic leaders, I guess leaders in town. So the head of the hospital, the mayor, the city manager, the publisher of the newspaper, the head of the steel mill, other business leaders. Dave Hagerberg, who was the board chair at Linfield but does a little bit of everything in town. That group gets together and to talk for an hour, the school superintendent, we get together to talk for an hour and a half about issues that are facing the community and what's going on at our own organizations, but also how can we work together to make the community stronger. And that has been, for me, the most satisfying and probably valuable interaction that I've had with the community.
What about relationship building with your kind of peer institutions, other presidents, other schools? I know recently we made an agreement with a school in France for a program, but how do those kind of relationships come about, and how do you foster those?
Well, it's a combination of strategy and personality. Some presidents like each other better than others do. And right now, in Oregon and in Washington, the presidents of the private colleges are unusually collegial. That wasn't always the case. When I first came here, it wasn't so much the case. But I remembered what it was like when I would sit in the room with the presidents of the colleges in the ACM, the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. And once they began to relax around each other and talk with each other, they really found that they had a lot of information to share with each other. And so this is something that I and the former president of UPS, who's now retired, really worked on. And at the, twice a year, the athletic conference presidents get together. We're required by the NCAA to get together and talk about athletic conference issues. We spend about 3 hours on those issues, and then we spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about higher education and our roles and what's going on at our campuses and so forth. That, it's interesting because presidents now do everything they can to avoid missing that meeting because we find it so useful. It's therapeutic. The fact is, though, that all it takes is one person to not cooperate, and it can sort of muddy that water. So far, though, so good. But once that trust is established, then we can have other conversations about our institutions, perhaps sharing certain costs or doing certain things together. It's always changing because there are always new presidents coming on. Now, the partnership with the University of Burgundy, this actually reveals something, I suppose, about my personality or the way I operate. As much as it was a strategy, but it was also an opportunity. We hired, as you know, Dr. Greg Jones to direct our wine education programs. Greg has a long-standing relationship and close friendship, really, with a climate viticulturist at the University of Burgundy in Dijon. And so when I was in France about a year ago, I visited them. This fellow had been on our campus for the International Terroir Congress that was held at Linfield a couple years ago. And so I visited him. I also visited other people who were involved with wine studies. Alex Meyer, a professor in the English department there, had already been on our campus because he was doing research in the archive about the relationship between Oregon and Burgundy. And so there were those points of connection, and maybe it's because I worked with a consortium years ago and because I did international education, but I thought, even if not a lot comes of it in a tangible way, just the symbolism of Linfield having a partnership with the University of Burgundy is a big deal. And then I learned that we were actually looking for a new institution to send our French language majors to, because the organization that we'd been working with before had gone out of business. And so that then added another dimension to this possible partnership. But what I would say, that it reveals about me is that it was opportunistic. When I was a graduate student in my final year of graduate school, my advisor came to me and he said, there's this professional theater in Missouri, a small professional theater, that is looking for a new artistic director. And he said, I think you'd really be good at that. I was 25 years old. Now, it was a small theater. That's why they were willing to hire somebody that young, I think. And it wouldn't have paid very much. But it was an equity theater. It was, it was a union theater. Mm-hmm. And I thought, there's no way in a million years I could do that. I'm not, I don't have the experience, I don't have the talent, and I didn't apply for it. The next summer, I needed to earn some money before I started my teaching job, and so I applied for to direct a play at that theater, and they hired me. And I got to know the new artistic director, and not only was he my age, but I didn't think he was very smart. And I thought, I could have done better than he's doing. I learned a really important lesson from that. And this is why I wound up going, from a faculty position to this consortium job, which was sort of a weird move. And then from the consortium job to a foundation presidency. I learned from that experience that if an opportunity suddenly arises that you didn't expect, you shouldn't automatically assume that it's the wrong thing to do. Now, yes, you want to have a plan for your life. You want to put yourself in a position so that when opportunities arise, you can seize them. But if the door opens, at least stick part of your head through the door and take a look around before you decide you don't want to go there. That's how I've operated my professional life, but it also is a way in which I've tried to look for opportunities for the college when they arise. Why is it that wine studies is here? Yes, it is true that I have always been fascinated by wine, but the real reason wine studies is at Linfield is because of our location. And it's because of our location that the International Pinot Noir Celebration is here. It's because of our location the Oregon Wine History Archive is here. It's because of our location that Greg Jones came to work here after Ellen Britton started our wine education program. It was an opportunity. So strategy and opportunity and culture, those are the three things that have to work together for something to succeed, I believe.
You've talked a lot about sort of international experience, international education. And obviously, that's a big part of the Linfield curriculum. So talk a little bit about sort of the importance of that for students here.
I think it's so important. It helps you in several ways. I mean, first of all, it's a little scary, and so when you go abroad for the first time, it's intimidating, but then I think it's thrilling when you realize that you can function on your own in a foreign culture. And I think it develops a sense of self and self-confidence that stays with you after you graduate from college. That can happen in college in other ways too, but I think it just is amplified with that international experience. Secondly, I think that it really, and this is something that people who haven't done this would be surprised to hear perhaps, it helps you understand your own culture much better. It's the ultimate comparison and contrast experience because you're living suddenly in this different culture, and lo and behold, things that you just assumed everybody did the same way are not the same. And you come to realize that some of the things that are normal in your life are actually culturally defined and not normal to all human beings at all. Which is then, I think, an important educational experience because it opens your mind to arguments, ideas, even facts that you probably weren't open to before. It's the same thing that a liberal arts college or liberal arts education does and is intended to do. It just makes it even richer and more valuable. And then finally, it makes you more culturally competent. No matter how many countries and languages you study, you're not going to study all of them. So you're not, but you come to realize not only that you can function in that culture and not only that your own norms are not the same norms there, you also become more sensitive to the differences and more appreciative of them and more able then to work and interact with people from other cultures. It makes the world safer. It also makes businesses more successful, given what's happened with globalization.
Obviously, one of the big kind of draws for a college campus is that there's a lot of events going on, a lot of sports and theater and art and music and everything else going on. And obviously, part of your role is supporting that. So how do you find time to balance your support of all the activities?
It's hard, actually, and I would say I was much better at this for the first 10 years of my presidency than I have been for the last 2, and that's because we're in the quiet phase of a campaign now. And so, I mean, I traveled 110,000 miles last year, so it is really hard. And I'm also getting older, and so I don't have as much energy as I once did. But again, I have to be opportunistic. So the softball team. I was on campus 2 of the weekends that we had home softball games, so I made sure that I got out to see them. I think there's one night that I'm going to be here and will be able to go to the play that's opening tonight. So I've got to put that on my calendar and make sure that I don't schedule something up against it. But the fact is that I'm going to miss some things this year that I would have liked to have done, and it just unfortunately sort of comes with the territory.
We've talked quite a bit about sort of the wine education and sort of the wine studies program and the Wagon Wheel History Archive and things like that. I'm curious what kind of reactions you've gotten from community alumni parents as that has become a reality and as you're talking about
it. It's very interesting. When the Board of Trustees first approved the creation of the Oregon Wine History Archive and helped me raise some money for it, Bernie Turner, who's an ordained American Baptist minister and had been on the board for a long time, said, "I think I can feel the ground moving underneath me," as in those Baptists are all rolling in their graves. Now, Bernie voted for this, so in fact, everyone did. It was a unanimous vote. So there are several things. I think that there is a small, but there's a small population of alumni and others who don't like it because it's alcohol. And I think in those cases, I obviously disagree with them because I don't think it's a different, wine is an alcoholic beverage, but it's not the same as other forms of alcohol. It's not treated the same, and people who are interested in it are not interested in it for the same reasons. If all they wanted to do was to imbibe as much as possible, they would spend a lot less money to do it. Then there are those who feel it's frivolous. And I've gotten, or I actually haven't directly, but the college has gotten a couple letters from alumni who worry that we're creating something that's frivolous and that has no really serious value in society. And that instead of devoting time and resources to something like studying wine, we should be spending more time and resources on other subjects. And I understand that argument, and I think that there's merit to that argument. But my response is that, first of all, this is an important business in Oregon. And in that respect, it's no different than any other business that we would choose to study. Second, that what we are doing is not training enologists or viticulturists. We're looking at wine from a variety of liberal arts perspectives in the same way that we can look at any other subject from a variety of perspectives. We could look at climate change from a variety of perspectives. What we're doing is giving students a set of tools that they can employ to look at other subjects in the future. If they decide to go into the wine industry, great, but they may wind up going into a different field altogether, but they will have learned about history and marketing and culture and science and economics, and those things are important and applicable everywhere. However, I will say that most people have been really excited by this. Parents, at least the ones who talk to me about it, think it's fun. Some of them say they wish they were in college now. Greg Jones told me about two different sets of parents who are so pleased that their kid has decided to minor in wine studies. And there actually are people who, we've been getting people from the wine industry, students whose parents were in the wine industry at Linfield long before we were doing this. And we're hearing from them. They're very excited, especially people who own family wineries and are hoping that their children will succeed them. Where we've gotten the most enthusiastic response, however, has been from the wine industry itself. The major was created in such a way that we're not, as I said, training these specialists. And that's exactly what people in the industry are wanting from undergraduates who are coming to work for them. It was very clear, as you know, Grace and Ken Evanstead have made a $6 million gift to Linfield College. $2 million to endow the wine studies professorship, $2 million to endow what is now the Evanstead Center for Wine Studies, Wine Education, and $2 million to help us with the science building, with a lab there that will include the study of fermentation. They did that in part because they are so impressed by the Linfield alumni and current students who are working for them. think they said they had 11 last summer, between full-time employees who had recently graduated and current students who had summer jobs. And they were so impressed by our students that they want to hire more of them. So they contacted us to talk about that. And that's when they came to realize that Greg Jones was here, and Greg has an international reputation for his work on climate change and wine. And one thing led to another, and suddenly they're making a $6 million gift to Linfield. Now, others in the industry don't have the ability to make that kind of a gift, but they are so pleased that we're doing this because they think that this is, well, Eugenia Keegan, who is the Oregon director for Jackson Family Wines, another very large international wine company, said that she believes that this program is creating the future leaders of Oregon's wine industry because of the way in which it's structured. We're training the people who will be the leaders because of the nature of this degree, as opposed to the people who will be working for the leaders. So that's very cool. And the Oregon Wine Board actually, you know, they gave me an award, but it's really Linfield's award. They only give this some years, and it's called, but at their annual symposium with, I don't know, a couple thousand people at the Oregon Convention Center, they presented me with the Oregon Wine Industry Partner Award. And that was because of what we've done with the archive, because of our history with the International Pinot Noir celebration, and now what we're doing with wine education.
Where do you hope Linfield will go in the future? What do you hope it looks like in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I hope that many of the things that we're already good at will continue to be good at and continue to be doing. I hope that we will have more students inspired and able to study abroad, for example. I hope that we will soon have a new science building. I think if and when that gets built, I think we're going to see a significant upsurge in science enrollments at the college. I hope that we're able to be nimble enough to respond to the way in which education is changing. We're preparing young people to be lifelong learners, but maybe we need to provide some of the venues for that lifelong learning. And there may be opportunities, you know, in addition to what we're currently doing, or different than what we're currently doing with online and continuing education, that could help people in that realm. I certainly hope that we continue to be an ethnically diverse institution. I really hope that we become better known nationally. But all of those things being said, a new president, Miles Davis, will have his own vision for the college, and I think he's a good person for Linfield. I think he's a good person to come at this time. You know, I think that he's entrepreneurial, he's energetic. I think because of his professional background, he's going to see opportunities that are different than the ones that I've seen. It doesn't mean that they're better or worse, but they're different. And he's going to be able to add those to what we're able to do. And I really wouldn't want to prejudge what he should be doing with his presidency, because any more than I hope that that such things were done before I came.
What about the sort of future of liberal arts colleges or independent colleges?
Well, you know, as I was saying earlier, I'm a little worried about that, because people, the general public and especially the media, have seemed to delight over the last 5 or 10 years in telling stories about how liberal arts is impractical and how college is not worth the money. And so I do worry about that. On the other, and quite a bit actually. On the other hand, all you have to do is look at what anyone who's a leader of a company or an organization has to say about what they're hoping their new
employees are going to have and what is going to be required in the future. And futurists, as well as these professionals, are all saying that people are going to need to be nimble and flexible and able to use a multitude of skills and be creative, that's going to be the most important skill. So I'm hoping that that eventually liberal arts will seem so impractical that some reporter will say, gee, look at this. Who would have ever thought liberal arts is a good thing to major in? I mean, last year, I read in the Wall Street Journal in an article about that big that English majors were getting paid almost as much as accountants by corporations coming out of college, because there was such a dearth of people who could write effectively. So, you know, that's my hope. I do think, though, that there's also the challenge of pedagogy. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think that, maybe, I don't know if there's a question to answer. I don't know what the change will be, but I think that young people now have grown up from the very beginning with kind of technology that people my age and even your age learned sometime after we were born. And so there are certain ways of learning from and with technology that they're accustomed to, that our model is still adapting to. And so how that will converge remains to be seen, and it will probably vary from one institution to the next. But here's the thing about colleges like Linfield that I've always believed, and that is that in our society, especially now as we are interacting with each other increasingly through technology rather than face-to-face, that first of all, there's a greater need than ever for personal human interaction, because otherwise I think our interaction and our ability to get along with each other is damaged or even fractured by this intermediary means of communication and interaction. And second, I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. I think that human beings still have a kind of instinctual need for community and for sharing with each other. Now, some of that happens, you know, now through technology, but there are fewer and fewer places for us to experience personalized community living together, eating together, working together, learning together. Residential liberal arts colleges do that so well, do it better than anything else. And so the irony is that we're under some threat, but in some respects are more important to our future than has ever been the case before.
What are your plans after leaving Linfield?
Julie and I are going to move to Portland. After our first winter, we loved Chicago. Many years ago, my plan was to, when I retired, to become a docent for the Chicago Architecture Foundation. Chicago has great architecture, and I used to go on all the architecture tours. That organization is just really impressive. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to study architecture and become a docent. After the first winter here, Julie said, well, maybe you're going to move back to Chicago, but I'm staying in Oregon. So I'm staying in Oregon, and actually I don't want to move back. Well, I miss the city, but I don't want to move back to Chicago for the same reason Julie doesn't. I mean, A, it's so beautiful here, and B, the weather's better. So we're moving to Portland. We're going to live in Northwest Portland. We really like that neighborhood. It's actually, you know, not so far from where the nursing school is. And Julie is 7.5 years younger than I, and she, you know, after she went back to work, she was first managing a senior citizens facility here in McMinnville, and then eventually became the head or a manager for investigators in a 5-county area who investigate senior abuse in facilities and foster homes and the like. And she can do that job from Portland as well as she can from McMinnville. And she's going to keep doing it at least for a little while, because she finds that she's happier when she's working. She's dedicated to that cause. It's really important work. She's, there saving people's lives. And so, but I'm 65, and I have made no commitments or plans aside from, sleep, and there's some books I want to read and things like that. I think that I'm sure we'll travel more, travel for pleasure more. I'm tantalized by the notion of living in France or Italy, but that won't happen until our dog Edgar is gone and Julie is retired. So.
Plus, you have to go to IPNC this summer. So.
Well, this summer I'm going. I wasn't sure if I would. I love the International Pinot Noir celebration, but I was a little worried about, it's understood, at least it's good form, for the old president to give the new president his or her space. And the irony is that we were picking up real estate guides in McMinnville because we thought we might retire here. And now this is the one place we can't retire, at least for a while. So we're moving to Portland, which is still pretty close. Anyway, the president historically at Linfield has given the welcome at IPNC, and I won't be doing that this summer. And so I thought, well, gee, should I even go? Should I let Miles sort of have his space? But I talked to him about it, and he said, if you want to come to IPNC, I don't see that that's a problem. So Julie and I and my brother and sister-in-law will stay in the HPs, and we'll be like everybody else.
That's awesome. What will you miss most about Linfield?
Students. Yeah, I think that, even when we lived in Chicago, we didn't realize this initially, but the neighborhood we lived in Chicago is sometimes called Wrigleyville. And if you talk to anyone who, at the beginning of their career, lived in Chicago, there's about a 90% chance that they lived in that neighborhood. A lot of apartments, restaurants and clubs, and a lot of young people who come there, rent their apartment, have their first job, are there for a couple of years, and then they meet somebody, or they move up and move on. And so we didn't really think about it when we moved there, but we really liked the vibe in the neighborhood. And this is a long time ago, but even so, I was still in my mid-30s. And we really liked the neighborhood and really liked the vibe, and moved there, and then realized that we were older than a lot of the other people in the neighborhood. And in fact, I had a friend who used to refer to it as the University of Wrigleyville, because it was 23 to 25-year-olds. So I've always liked being around young people. Julie likes being around old people. That's why she married me. And I will miss the students. That's what I'll miss the most.